Welcome back, everybody. I'm Yossi Goslin, NBA salary cap expert, and in this video, I want to discuss the Brooklyn Nets, a team that has a surplus of draft picks after trading Kevin Durant and Kyrie Irving, and a bunch of upcoming cap space that they're going to try to use to bring in an all-star, maybe two. So that's what they're hoping to do, but they're also just really bad right now, and they're staring down the barrel of a rebuild. So I want to also go over what that scenario could be like and just weigh the downside of continuing down this path versus taking a step back and resetting things. But before I get into that, this is still a pretty new channel. So if you're new to the channel or if you've been here before, please subscribe and like if you haven't already. It would help with the channel's growth tremendously. But let's take a look at the Nets payroll so far and see what their situation is like heading into the offseason. So they are set to operate as an over-the-cap team, meaning that they're only going to be able to increase their payroll via trade, re-signing their own free agents, and they have several spending exceptions they could use to increase payroll. Now, whatever they do, they are not going to want to exceed the $171.3 million luxury tax line. They are about $37 million below it, though, which is plenty of flexibility for them to re-sign Nick Claxton and field the rest of the roster. After spending over $170 million in luxury tax payments between 2021 and 2023, they're going to want some financial relief, especially while the team is this bad. Now, as far as trade opportunities go, they have plenty of expiring contracts that they can use towards salary matching, mainly Ben Simmons' $40 million amount, which can go a long way to help acquire just about anybody that becomes available. And they also have a surplus of first round picks that they can use as sweeteners, mainly from Phoenix. They can trade a maximum of 7 first round picks, and I imagine that that's what they mainly want to do, include in their trade packages to get a potential all-star or someone. So Nick Claxton is ineligible to extend before the end of the season, so he is going to become an unrestricted free agent. The Nets will have his full bird rights, so they won't have any restrictions to what they could sign him to. Now, I can see his next contract breaking above the $20 million annual range, more than what guys like Clint Capella, Jakob Poeltl, Jared Allen, would that tier of center are currently making. Now, I don't think that the center market is strong enough that he'll be able to get significantly more than that, but I could be wrong. But this is a salary projection I could see him getting roughly $22 million annually. Now, however much Claxton ends up getting, I think there's a very strong likelihood that the Nets structure his contract so he has a decrease in year 2 while increasing in subsequent seasons. The reason for that is because it gives the Nets a little more cap space in 2025. They did the same exact thing with Cam Johnson in his contract last summer, and I would expect them to do the same with Claxton. I want to quickly touch on Mikal Bridges because he's also extension eligible, but for a brief window from October 1st until the start of the regular season later that month. This is the most he can get, 3 years, $113 million, and I'm sure the Nets will offer it, but I highly doubt he accepts it, and that's mainly because I think could probably get a lot more as a free agent in 2026. The salary cap is going to keep rising, and I think a big baseline for what he could be getting depends on what OG Anunoby gets this summer. Very possible that contract exceeds this extension amount. But if Bridges does want to extend with the Nets, I think it also makes more sense to do it next year when he get out a 4th year. That's roughly $43 million. Now, because of the timing of this particular extension, if he were to take it, it would make him ineligible to be traded for the rest of the season in case the Nets were interested in pivoting later down the line. Conversely, though, if traded first, he would not be able to extend with his new team for 6 months. Now, before I get into what the Nets could potentially do this season, I want to show their cap space projection for next year. So keep in mind, I plugged in Nick Claxton with that projected salary I gave him with that decrease in year 2, and they're expected to have 2 first-round picks next year, one from Phoenix and one that could likely come from Oklahoma City through some complicated pick swaps. Now, they're in a position to generate somewhere between $30 to $50 million in cap space. I could see them moving on from Durant and Finney-Smith at some point, which could help further increase those projections. Now, some of these factor in Cam Thomas and Sharpe making it to restricted free agency. At a minimum, they could have about like $30 million in cap space while being able to go over the cap later and re-sign them, assuming that they're not extended. So I bring this up because both those guys are extension eligible this summer as well. But and with Cam Thomas in particular, if he extends and he could command somewhere between like 20 to 25 million dollars annually, that could significantly decrease their cap space if he's extended now. If they don't extend him, instead he would make it to restricted free agency and he would have that $12 million cap hold interfering with their cap space. So how it would work is they have that $12 million occupying their space, they spend their cap space, then they could go over the cap to re-sign him to whatever they want. And also, in Brooklyn's quest to acquire an all-star, it's very possible that another team will covet Cam Thomas in a trade. But if they extend him now, it's going to complicate the salary matching component involving him. So for all these reasons I just outlined, the Nets may not extend Day'Ron Sharpe or Cam Thomas. However, if they are able to accomplish a lot of their goals early on in the offseason, then yeah, they might as well extend them. And before I get into pipe dream scenarios, I want to go over what a potential rebuild for the Nets could look like, because they just experienced the absolute harshest downside of being bad and not having control of your draft when they conveyed the third overall pick to Houston last month. So for those that don't understand why the Nets can't simply rebuild, it's because they still owe a good amount of draft equity to the Rockets from the James Harden trade. They still owe an unprotected first in 2026 and pick swaps in 2025 and 2027. So they basically can't bottom out for the next 3 seasons. And in last year's trade deadline, the Rockets reportedly offered a combination of some of Brooklyn's picks back to them and Jalen Green for Mikal Bridges, and the Nets declined, and Jalen Green went on an absolute heater shortly after. Now, I highly doubt that this was the entire package on the table, and whatever was offered back then is probably worse now. If the Rockets are still interested in Mikal Bridges. But I'm just trying to illustrate how much of their draft equity is still controlled by Houston. Now, I feel that at this point, the Nets could get back to relevance faster if they enter a brief rebuild, which would involve getting some of these picks back if such an offer is still on the table. Because the longer that they strike out on potential all-star targets, the more opportunities to select and develop young players pass by, and the more they'll get punished. So let's say the Nets are able to trade Mikal Bridges to the Rockets and they get back Jalen Green, the third overall pick in this year's draft, and they cancel the 2025 first round swap. So now the Nets have 2 lottery picks to look forward to over these next 2 seasons that they're able to bring in, develop, and they still have enough salary cap flexibility to have over $60 million in 2025. So now you go into the next 2 seasons with a lot less pressure to overachieve just for the sake of not conveying a valuable pick. And you have more time to develop guys, and you still have the assets with the restricted free agents and some of their young players to pursue all-stars if they become available. They probably won't be in a position to compete or entice an all-star anytime soon if they go down this path. But I feel that this path and the current path that they're on right now have pretty equal probability outcomes in terms of how long it'll take to be relevant again. So I think this is a totally fine trade and outcome for the Rockets if they decide to pivot, because at least here they're actually building towards something. So what kind of scenario are the Nets hoping for? I don't think bringing in a guy like Donovan Mitchell or Trae Young is really going to thread the needle for them, even in this relatively weak Eastern Conference. So I'm going to go with Giannis Antetokounmpo as my example. I don't necessarily think he's available right now, but there are teams definitely hoping that something changes in Milwaukee, and he is the type of guy that I think would really make all this worth it. So I sent out Ben Simmons as the matching salary. That trade works, and however many first round picks are needed to make this happen. And that's just a simple transaction. I'm sure it'd be way more complicated. I'm sure more teams would be involved. I'm sure they might have to include guys like Cam Johnson or Cam Thomas. But just for simplicity's sake, I'm just making that swap. And when you see the team, they get to fill out the rest of the roster and barely avoid the tax. They wouldn't have enough flexibility under the tax to use the mid-level exception, but that's fine because this front office is actually pretty good at convincing good vets to sign for the veteran minimum. Like last season, it was Dennis Smith Jr., Lonnie Walker. So I'm sure they might find a couple more studs with that. And they still have some other players left in this scenario, like Dorian Finney-Smith, Dennis Schroeder, that they can use for salary matching purposes and combine with whatever draft picks they have left or some of these other players that teams might covet to get a potential other all-star or starter level player. And now I'm looking ahead with Giannis Antetokounmpo in, but instead of swapping Ben Simmons' expiring contract for him, now I swapped Cam Johnson and Dorian Finney-Smith, which is probably a more likely trade anyways. And Brooklyn might prefer that just because they do have money for this season. So with them out and Giannis in, they are able to generate close to $40 million in 2025 cap space. Now, that isn't quite enough for a player like Donovan Mitchell and his max, which is about $10 million more than this, but they're close enough where they could potentially leverage a sign and trade that could involve some of their restricted free agents like Cam Thomas or Daron Sharpe, assuming they hadn't been extended yet, or some other players that they have under contract. So, in theory, yes, the Nets do have the resources and the flexibility to pull something like this off. And this is the type of build that, in my opinion, would make all this worth it. But I'm just very skeptical that they'll be able to pull anything like this off. And when weighing the downside of what would happen if they can't do something quite like this, I just feel like I would strongly consider getting my picks back for Mikal Bridges if that opportunity was still available. It's totally possible that by the time an all-star does become available and does want to go to Brooklyn, enough time would have passed that they may have been better off spending this next year or two rebuilding through the draft and accumulating more assets and developing guys. So that's my opinion on the whole situation. But let me know what you guys think. Do you think the Nets should continue on this path and hope that they can accomplish this type of scenario, or should they just pull the plug and enter a rebuild? Let me know in the comments.